Firstly, thank you to the Research Impact Academy for inviting me to talk today. We're going to explore some storytelling principles and how they can help when developing research communications. Every year, research is conducted on a range of life-changing, sometimes world-changing topics. And while some of these insights will get good coverage and pick up with industry, policymakers and the public, many unfortunately won't. Research rarely speaks for itself. However rigorous, however insightful, however groundbreaking, if its communication falls short, in many cases, so does its potential impact. Months, sometimes years of careful work, only for it to struggle to get the attention it deserves. Not because the research isn't valuable, but because it wasn't communicated in a way that people could grasp, remember and act on. Clearly, this is a huge waste of energy. And I believe there is an opportunity to improve this through research adopting more storytelling techniques to help knowledge diffusion, as many global industrial strategies will describe it. The process through which knowledge, particularly scientific knowledge, is disseminated and utilised to foster technological innovation and economic growth. It's something we've been doing for a number of years now, and while there is much to learn, there are common things which we've seen that I wanted to share with you today. The storytelling triggers different responses from people. It's interesting that when we hear the word storytelling, most people immediately think of fiction, Netflix, novels and fairy tales, which I think is an issue for its adoption in science communication, because storytelling actually began as the way humans remembered facts that really mattered. Our lives depended on it. Which berries were poisonous, when to plant crops, how to avoid getting eaten. Story was and still is our primary built-in data storage and sharing tool. As Roy Sutherland put it, storytelling is like the PDF format. It compresses complex information into a portable, shareable format that many people can easily understand and pass on. And yet, in research communication, where facts really matter, we're oddly suspicious of storytelling. As if the moment you tell a story, you've abandoned objectivity and wandered into creative writing. Storytelling and narrative, I don't see them as decoration. They're not a garnish on top of the science. I see them as the DNA of good communication itself. They give research a frame, they make it resonate, and they're the key to turning information into impact. So how do we get better at using it? Well, let's start with the good news. We are all storytellers. We're born storytellers. It's how we make sense of the world. Every day, every hour, every minute, we tell and retell stories to others and to ourselves. So why are we here today? If storytelling is so natural, why do we spend so much time and energy trying to improve at it? Well, here's a critical challenge and something I suspect you'll come across a lot when thinking about storytelling. While we do tell stories instinctively, we don't always do it effectively or consistently. When we're dealing with something complex, like research full of data, evidence and rational arguments, we can get blinded by the detail. The story disappears under the weight of the information. It's what often called the curse of knowledge, the difficulty experts have in simplifying what they know without losing meaning. There's a wonderful book by Jonathan Gottschall called The Storytelling Animal, and in it he writes, "Story is for human as water is for fish, all encompassing and not quite palatable." That really struck a chord with me. Stories aren't an add-on, they are how we understand reality, but because we're so immersed in them, we underestimate their power. We sometimes reduce storytelling to something made up, instead of recognising it as the most human way to process information, data and ideas. And that's why today's task isn't easy. Explaining how to use storytelling can feel a bit like teaching fish why water matters. I'm going to share 3 principles along with some examples which I hope will help you. These are not a silver bullet solution. They're tools I always go back to when I'm working with researchers to help them explain their work. The first principle I want to share is structure. When I sit with researchers to help shape their communications, this is something we look at regularly. A clear structure is the difference between overwhelming your audience with data and helping them see meaning. At its simplest, story structure comes down to 3 parts. Context, where are we? What's the situation? Who's the main character? Allowing the audience to orientate themselves. Problem, what challenges exist? What's at stake if we don't act? What do we need to solve this? And resolution, how do we, or did we solve it? And what's the outcome? Where next? Together, these 3 steps move us forward. We are actively looking for cause and effect, and these 3 stages take us on that journey. We're problem-solving animals. And often, we'll use this pattern multiple times to walk an audience through a complex piece of work. The context, the problem, the solution structure is repeated again and again. So we're slowly moving the audience from one point to the other and not losing them on the way. This 3-part act, if you will, because it does share its origins with classical story structure, shows up with lots of different phrases. The fundamentals are the same, cause and effect, but background, barrier, resolution, hypothesis, challenge, results. They have the same principles and the same meaning. And because this is a science and research audience, I thought I'd point you to one in particular that was developed by Richard Olson, and but therefore. And but therefore is a narrative structure developed that uses these 3 words to connect 3 stages of a story. And for the setup or familiar facts, but for the introduction of conflict or a problem, and therefore for the resolution or consequence that moves the narrative forward. He studied many different famous and successful speeches that changed how people viewed each other and the world, and he identified that and but therefore structure showed up in many of them. For example, he studied the speeches of presidential elections, and those that were successful often used a high percentage of and but therefore. If you're interested, he wrote a book in which he explains EBT in more detail, Why Science Needs a Story. I'd recommend it if you're more interested in this approach. When I interview researchers to help them with their stories, my questions are structured around these 3 stages. It tends to help them explain their work to me, and they can sense how the interview will translate into a written piece, a presentation, or a script. Here you can see some visuals of a project we carried out for the University of Leeds in the UK. We interviewed over 50 researchers to create long format stories of their research across a range of topics. The questions we used and the structure for each story follow this pattern. Principle 2 is emotion. If structure is the skeleton, emotion is the muscle and blood around it. People don't just remember facts. They remember how those facts made them feel. And that doesn't mean melodrama, it means finding the human pulse inside the insights. Who does it affect? Why does it matter? What changes if we get this wrong or right? By explaining these points through emotion, we transport the audience into the story. If you think about stories as a virtual simulator, you want to transport the audience to those key moments of emotion so they get as close to experiencing it themselves as possible. The idea of narrative transportation actually comes from communication and psychology research itself, particularly the work of Melanie Green and Timothy Brock in the early 2000s. They found that when people are transported into a story, when they feel immersed, they not only remember the information more deeply, they're also more likely to shift their attitudes and even their behaviour. In other words, stories don't just help us understand, they help us care. And once we care, we're much more open to learning, to remembering, and to acting. So how do we transport people into a story? There are a number of assets which you can use. Here are 3 of my favourites. So, people quotes and testimony. There is something uniquely powerful about hearing directly from the experiences of others. A statistic tells you what happens. A human quote can show you what it felt like. When someone speaks in their own words, whether in text or audio, it brings authenticity and immediacy that no amount of analysis can easily replicate. It creates empathy. It gives the researcher a voice and a face. In the end, people may question data, but they rarely forget a story told by another human being. This is a quote as shown here from a long read story about some research carried out during COVID that helped to enable dentists to reopen in the UK, including the School of Dentistry in Leeds, which until then had been closed for safety reasons. Providing quotes from the team about how they felt during this process helps the audience connect with the work and start to understand what was really happening and why it mattered. The same story includes photography, which is my second asset that I would recommend trying to use. Photography can be really powerful to transport an audience. A single image can collapse paragraphs of explanation into an instant recognition. It doesn't have to be a professional image. Think of how many documentaries use personal photos to help explain a topic. Sometimes they even work more effectively than a professional image because they show a degree of authenticity, which I think matters more and more in the world that we live in today. And when you combine these photographs with sympathetic sound design, photography can generate something close to a film-like experience, one that reaches both the head and the heart. But most importantly, it reduces the cognitive load for our audience. They don't have to imagine what a situation looks like. They can see it with their own eyes. That immediacy makes the research feel tangible. From the same story that we were talking about with dentistry, these images show the model the research team used to carry out tests along with technical visual illustrations of the results. Both are important and help with the communication of this piece of work. And finally, film. Film is perhaps the most powerful tool we have to transport an audience quickly and emotionally because it mimics real life as seen through our own eyes. Here we have the same story from the previous two slides but told directly from one of the researchers involved. They could bring to life their work in even more detail for the audience, talking directly to them. This project actually included a number of stages. We spent time with each researcher helping them to develop their story and then help them prepare to share it on camera. There are many ways film can be used. This is just one example. The key is that the moving image can really help to communicate complex work simply by making it easier for them to process. Quite often I've had instances where researchers have footage or photography, but they feel like it's not good enough quality to be used. And really, I would always just say keep it captured together and then work with communication teams to kind of see if it can be used, because it really adds a huge level of authenticity to work, and it really helps from a storytelling point of view for an audience to connect. Collecting assets like quotes, photography and footage, however rough, will help you when you share projects with a wider audience. We understand the world through stories, and it's no coincidence that YouTube, film, television dramas and documentaries are so popular. We test drive stories and see how they fit within our world. Research in science communication is no different. If you want to reach a larger audience, consider how you can use these assets to support your work. The Below film explained research studying the sun at the University of Lancaster. We had the opportunity to use film to really bring their work to life for a public audience. I'd accept that selecting and knitting these kind of things together isn't always easy, and not every project can justify a budget to produce a film like the one shown here, but that's why I'm a big advocate of the creative communication industry and finding ways for us to work with researchers and science communicators to see where we can work effectively to bring better communications to the public. But ultimately, trying to find an opportunity to include some of these assets will certainly help you humanise and share your story. And finally, principle number 3 is delivery. Because even the best structure with the right emotional material can fall flat at this stage. Delivery is about considering when and where your audience will be. Where will it be used and in what format? Is the story best told as a film, a report, a live presentation, a social post? Maybe all of those. The medium should fit the message and the audience. In 2024, we were asked to help with communicating 10 research projects that showcase collaboration between the University of Leeds and partners in Africa. The annual event would have visitors at the university in person, but in addition, an audience would be remotely watching a number of the talks via Zoom over a 3-day period. So in between these talks, the university wanted the 10 projects to be showcased, and the plan was to share the stories on A1 posters outside the actual rooms themselves where the talks were taking place. So when guests were kind of popping to the toilet or getting a coffee, they could take a look in between the breaks. But in addition, we had to create digital versions that could be played to remote guests watching on Zoom while they waited for the next talk to start. Now, most of the research boards we have seen in the past were not the greatest. These 3 examples show that often they're complex, quite cluttered. And so one of the questions we're asking ourselves is, how can we improve this experience? We didn't want the different projects fighting with each other. We wanted them to have a degree of consistency. In addition, we had to think about how we could make it work for an online audience as well as a physical audience who were there in person. So our approach was to capture each story using the context, problem and solution structure as we discussed earlier, but then we used a typical research poster structure and developed 8 sections that would walk an audience through the project. So this would create 8 PowerPoint slides for each project, and then these could be used in a typical digital format for presentation, for example, but also easily converted into an A1 board. So we structured the stories into these 8 chapters: the title, the background, goals, approach, challenges, impact and learnings, and looking to the future. So at first glance, that looks more complex than a 3-stage arc as described earlier, but actually it's just a detailed version of context, problem, solution. The first 3 chapters are context, the next 2 chapters are problem, and the final 3 are solution. So you can see here an example of how the A1 poster would appear, and you can see even from this visual how that could be divided up into 8 slides. And this allowed us to kind of create these kind of PowerPoint slides to say that the researchers could use, but we could also create these animations or videos that would play remotely to audiences while they were waiting for talks. They were kind of on loop in the background. All of them included imagery that the researchers had shared as per my last kind of principle. And they also included quotes from those involved to quickly explain the project. In fact, we started with a human quote on every single slide because we felt that was one of the fastest ways. If you were standing there and you only had a brief amount of time to kind of look at the posters, it would very quickly take you through and explaining what was happening, what they were looking to achieve. And then if you needed more information, you wanted more, there were bullets underneath that gave you more detail. And it's this kind of decision-making process, and how do you kind of filter that information in the context that we were dealing with people at an event, as well as people dialing in. It's very much what I'm describing in regards to delivery. This structure helped us approach each story and ensure we were able to deliver a useful, understandable but consistent format. By keeping them aligned with this structure, audiences could quickly process multiple projects once they understood the format. So when we talk about using storytelling to communicate more effectively, I suggest considering the many shapes and sizes that stories can take to support your work, the different ingredients and how they can be used in different ways, in different combinations to communicate more effectively. So to summarise, include strong structure, share emotion on the content, deliver it in a suitable format for where your audience is. Do that and hopefully more research will live in people's minds and it can spread and influence. Because when we get storytelling right, research doesn't just inform, it inspires. Thank you.